So I'm very grateful for the invitation, and I apologize for my accent. So my title is What Went Wrong and What is Left? James and Royce in 1900 French Philosophy. I shall deal in this presentation with the reception of James and Royce in France, with a special emphasis on the turn of the 20th century. My hypothesis is that something went seriously wrong at that time, which explains in part why James's reception was so distorted, and also why Royce was so little read in France, both in 1900 and in 2000. So my first claim will be that both men suffered from misconceptions which later, for very different reasons, had important philosophical consequences. Still, if some misunderstandings have to be highlighted, I do not think that their main common concerns and quarrels, for example concerning the absolute, were totally ignored by French philosophers. So my second claim, developed in the second section, is that their dialogue was not alien to French philosophers. Extant materials already allow us to address major issues concerning what is common to James and Royce, and I shall focus, so in the second section, on three occasions involving idealism, voluntarism, and reference, where their discussion might be resumed today. So first section, a confused reception for James. James's relations with French philosophers around 1900 resemble all friendships. They involve a good deal of affection and a good deal of misunderstandings also. Two series of reasons at least account for that confused reception. First, the texts that were available, that were at hand, and second, the use that was made of James's philosophy by major academic philosophers. First, the texts that were available. Until recently, two major works by James had never been translated into French. The Principles of Psychology, still not translated, and second, the essays in Radical Empiricism that we translated in 2005, so 1 century after the essays were written. It's downstairs if you want to check it. So we shall better keep in mind in what follows that most of the discussions took place while these two books were not available in French. Even worse, James's Pragmatism was translated only in 1911, after James's death, at a time when the debate over pragmatism was a little less vivid. So in 1905-1908, when pragmatism was discussed everywhere, people and readers had to gather what James's brand of pragmatism was all about from two sources. First, from the earliest papers of The Will to Believe, in their partial translation by Renouvier in his journal La Critique Philosophique, and second, from the poor and heavily edited 1906 translation of the Varieties. It can safely be argued that this limited availability of James's texts played a major role in the distortion his pragmatism suffered in the first years of the 20th century. By a distortion, I mean that James's position was generally construed from his earliest statements, and his more considered views concerning radical empiricism and psychology were not part of the picture. So this tendency was reinforced by the way James was introduced to French readers, so by these established philosophers. James was introduced to French readers around 1900 by established philosophers such as Renouvier, Boutroux, and Bergson. These first waves of readers made a genuine philosophical use of James's texts, but certainly did not allow a comprehensive view of his thoughts. So his works were mainly instrumental for purposes which were independent of his own development. First, Charles Renouvier. As I already mentioned, the earliest papers of The Will to Believe were translated by Renouvier as soon as they were published in the 1870s and early 80s. And they have long been James's only text available in French. As a result, the other features of James's work, his pragmatism, his radical empiricism, and to a lesser degree his psychology, have often been read from that standpoint. That is to say, as if there were further developments of what James had already said in The Will to Believe. Renouvier and his lieutenants, Pillon and Dauriac, repeatedly pictured James as a criticist, that is to say, as a philosopher close in spirit to the Kantian type of moral philosophy they were advocating. And they read what was not in line with this reading as betrayal of the early text. Then a strange situation developed. La Critique philosophique, which was in some ways James's tribune in France, was, because of its philosophical commitments, at odds with several of the main trends in James's thought. This is particularly clear as regards his psychology, whose physiological cornerstones were dismissed by Renouvier when he first read the paper on emotion, and then later by Pillon and Dauriac when they read the principles of psychology, and that was still worse with his pragmatism. So James embodied to them the mystery of a philosopher who had started in the same atmosphere as they had, but who had gradually developed in different, if not opposite, directions. Second, Émile Boutroux, who had James elected to the Institut de France, and who wrote the first book on James in French after he died. So he played a major role, but his works construe James's concept of experience as something subjective and solipsistic, which is, to say the least, which involves a major misunderstanding of James's radical empiricism. I've explored the relationship elsewhere, and I won't get into more detail here. Third, as regards Henri Bergson, things are complex. Even though both men deeply admired each other, I'm thinking of the warm letter James wrote in response to creative evolution or of the appendix of a pluralistic universe, Bergson had a hard time disentangling for the French public his own doctrine from pragmatism. And the foreword he wrote for the 1911 translation of Pragmatism is certainly no exception. Bergson, indeed, had not much sympathy for pragmatism, since it seemed to imply a technological approach to reality that was at odds with his own method of intuition. Even on the most famous point, the theory of images of chapter 1 of Matter and Memory, which seems to anticipate or to echo James's world of pure experience, one should not forget that it is chapter 1, superseded by the philosophy of duration and memory that Bergson develops in the remainder of the book. So I submit that most of the times, both men are better seen as allies against certain form of dull rationalism. And for most readers, confusions between these two distinct philosophies did not help assessing James's real insights. So the next step was Jean Val and his thesis on the pluralistic philosophies. The first full-scale survey of James's thought, taking into account James's radical empiricism, was made by a philosopher who started with James. And it was certainly Jean Val's 1920 thesis, The Pluralistic Philosophies of England and America. His most penetrating readers saw at once that the whole book was imbibed with James's philosophy. It turned pluralism into a problem, and it explored interesting comparisons between James and Bradley. Val's claim was that James, as Bradley had done, had seen that reality is supra-relational, that relations, whether internal or external, were only one step in the apprehension of reality. So it's a controversial interpretation, but still an interesting one. And as a result, Val stressed connections between James's thought and existentialism and phenomenology at the turn of the 30s. And Val's Traité de métaphysique, composed from his Sorbonne courses, is crammed with James on the topic of relations. And it certainly proved to be the main source of Jamesian philosophy to many readers. One of his most famous students, Gilles Deleuze, is explicit on that point. But it is certainly also true for hundreds of other students. Val, who was very suspicious of the growth of logical positivism and even of John Dewey's philosophy, which seemed to him too systematic, he said it was like buildings on a skyline, is in particular responsible for the idea that Americanism Americanism, as he called the tension he found within James's text, might have found its expression in American art, and in particular in American novels, rather than in American philosophy. As a result, most of James's readers came from the field of literary studies, and most of the time, James was not read within the context of Peirce, Dewey, and Royce's challenges. Last step, the revival of pragmatism, as far as James is concerned, and the most recent wave of readings was prompted, as in many countries, by the debate between Professor Putnam and Professor Rorty over pragmatism, and by the translation of several of Professor Putnam's major books in France. In addition to this debate, James has met much interest in Wittgenstein scholarship, discussions over rules and pragmatism, over Wittgenstein's philosophy of psychology, over the different varieties of realism, have made James a major reference at last. I just mentioned two facts to demonstrate this point. A conference was recently devoted to James's principles, which involved a host of neuroscientists, and so which proves that the principles are not unapproachable anymore in France. Another conference this year on pragmatism and quantum mechanics featured two quantum physicists, and one of them, Chris Fuchs, built his whole presentation on James. James is not limited to literary circles anymore, and there is good hope that the major misunderstandings Yeats had suffered around 1900 are vanishing for good. So I turn to section 2, that would be the invisible Royce, with a question mark. Royce's reception is definitely less notable than that of James in France. Only one of Royce's texts was translated. It's The Philosophy of Loyalty, and it was in 1946, a long time ago. Everything needs thus to be done in that field, and in what follows, I shall focus on several minor occasions where some readings of Royce, in particular those in which Royce is in dialogue with James, might have provided important clues in the debate. Royce's meeting with French philosophers certainly represents a missed opportunity, since in the report on the 1908 Heidelberg Congress of Philosophy, Royce's paper, The Problem of Truth in the Light of Recent Discussion, was clearly pictured as an outstanding contribution, as one of the strongest challenges to pragmatists. Still, in addition to short reviews in the major philosophical periodicals, and to a more recent study by Gladys Bournick, Royce was the subject of 3 commentaries. I think that each one of them could provide a point where the debate could be resumed today, and each one of them offers a standpoint from which Royce and James's dialogue can be grasped and explored. They are, starting from the most recent, a long series of papers by Gabriel Marcel in 1918, later retrieved in his Royce's Metaphysics, so republished in 1945 in France and in 1956 in the English translation. Second, that's the commentaries of a short-lived philosopher, Henri Robet. I'll just say a word about him, which focuses on the world and the individual. That was in 1907. And third, that of Charles Renouvier in the Critique philosophique in 1888, which focuses on the religious aspect. So first, subsection Marcel and Royce. Gabriel Marcel was to launch a strong current of Christian existentialism in his journal Metaphysique, 1927, made, just after World War I, an extensive study of the mature Royce, which was to remain for a very long time the only general survey available in French, and even for some time one of the few available in English after its translation in 1956. Since recent papers have been devoted to Marcel and Royce in the transactions, I shall be brief. Marcel's reading implied that Royce's philosophy as a whole could only be grasped from the mature standpoint of the problem of Christianity. And Marcel, rereading his book in 1956, emphasized 3 important points in Royce that still deserve interest: his dialectic of love, his triadism, his doctrine of science, his philosophy of loyalty, which would be a strong antidote to the current individualistic trends Marcel deplored. If some points of Marcel's presentation are controversial, in particular his presentation of Royce's philosophy as a system and his criticism of omniscience in Royce, he certainly drew attention to Royce's thoughts and he helped give him his due place as a major philosopher, which was no trivial matter indeed at that time. It is just ironic that the book certainly had more influence in Royce's country than in Marcel's. Still, Marcel became in later days more responsive to James's pluralism, and it is an interesting question to inquire whether this responsiveness would change in detail his reading and maybe our reading of Royce. And yesterday's session has provided several interesting insights on that question. Second subsection, voluntarism. In the course of preparing this talk, I found a philosopher, Henri Robet, a Christian socialist, who died young just before World War I, and who made a detailed and profound analysis of Royce's philosophy in La Revue Philosophique in 1907. His paper, which emphasized Royce's voluntarism in order to point out his resemblances with pragmatists, tried hard to find a position strong enough to balance Schiller's humanism, but a position that would still be compatible with pragmatism. Robet, who also had some correspondence with John Dewey, overworked himself and died early in 1913. Very interestingly, while browsing Robet's own book at the library at l'École Normale Supérieure, I have found in Robet's own copy of the Studies in Humanism of Schiller's a manuscript letter of Schiller folded in the book, which was given to the library, so I guess nobody opened the book since that time. I opened it. And so Schiller praised him for his 1907 paper on Royce, and this letter is a highly interesting document for two reasons. It described the pragmatic movement in 1907, and second, Schiller cast doubts on Royce's compatibility with it, in particular as regards its concept of purpose. So one second question, using Robet's insight, would be, is there an account of practice and of purposiveness in the field of the philosophy of mind that could cover a common ground between James and Royce? And third and last point, I shall be brief on this point, reference Royce's challenge in 1885. Finally, one important dimension of James and Royce's dialogue, the argument from error and its absolutist consequences, showed up briefly and early on the French stage. That it was a major challenge to Royce, to James, is not controversial. It had the same effects on other philosophers. For example, Christopher Hookway, in his Themes from Peirce, has given an outstanding reading of Peirce's reply to the religious aspect of philosophy. Hookway claims, convincingly, that it was the occasion for a major discovery or rediscovery by Peirce that reference to external things is primarily indexical and demonstrative and not descriptive. It is striking that simultaneously to this reply to Royce, the same chapter had a similar effect on William James. Jim Conant, among others, has emphasized the role of this work in James's development, and he has claimed that radical empiricism could be read as a response to this very chapter in Royce's book. Royce's problem, his legacy to philosophy, does not concern matter, substance and cause, the classical problems for empiricists, but according to James, reference. How can a thought, I quote, refer to, intend or signify any particular reality outside of itself? Royce's solution, involving an infinite and all-inclusive mind, seemed at that time inescapable to James. He said, we are inclined to think him right and to suspect his idealistic escape from the quandary may be the best one for us all to take. And this leads us back to the French scene, because we see in James and Renouvier's correspondence in 1888 some first attempts by James to escape the absolutist implications of Royce's argument. Renouvier had given in La Critique philosophique 2 installments of a commentary upon Royce, and this commentary focused on the argument from error, and it is no surprise since it was prompted by James, who drew Renouvier's attention to that book. I shall just remark here that this commentary was important enough to be acknowledged by Royce himself in his studies of good and evil. What then could be so important? 4 short points can be made, just direction. I won't get into the details of the arguments, but first, Renouvier thought that a proper answer to Royce would involve the vindication of the reality of relationships, and he understood Royce as denying this reality. So Renouvier's first claim is that relations are as real as terms. And this is certainly something James would not overlook at that time. Second, Renouvier tried to show that one can account for the possibility of error without involving an infinite knower. He thought that as long as finite consciousness can have among its representations the representation that others can have different representations about the same thing, that would be enough. So his second claim is that error can be understood from the standpoint of the finite knower, and as it seems from the standpoint of the community of finite knower. So he thought that a concatenated system, a system de proche en proche, from next to next, would do the same job. He further thought that Royce's position strikingly resembled that of Spinoza, and that the major problem Royce would have to face would be that of the individual. And so Renouvier's third claim is that Royce turns the individual into a mystery. And this last claim is highly interesting from the standpoint of Royce's later development. Finally, Renouvier thought that contrary to what James did, Royce did not confront major problems such as the infinite, of determinism and of free will. Moreover, he thought that there was a conflict between Royce's ethical argument and his cold tone in the whole book. So James, who agreed on most points, was not totally satisfied with Renouvier's papers on Royce. He thought that Renouvier had not seen that Royce's problem was concerned not with the ascertaining of truth, but with its constitution. Still, if Royce's solution was inescapable to James, he nevertheless clearly acknowledged that Renouvier's conception of the universe was a powerful weapon against Royce's monism. In other words, if we are to speak of truth and reference at all, James accepted that Royce had proved the necessity of admitting the absolute, that it was a presupposition of reference. Nonetheless, James claims that this absolute was by no means necessarily monistic, that it was compatible with pluralism, and he wrote to Renouvier, and here use systems of relations, de proche en proche, from next to next, would come in. So, a short word of conclusion. I think that that last line of thought, where relations are as real as terms, where the unity of the world is not a priori, but made up from next to next, if not the definitive answer to Royce, certainly made its way in James's thought. If I'm not wrong, the 3 debates I've mentioned help qualifying the feeling that a first glance at the literature might cause. James has been seriously misunderstood. That is true. Royce has not been much read. That is also true. There is still much work to be done in order to defend James's pragmatism against its misunderstandings. Still, some crucial elements are available in the fresh French reception of both James and Royce that might help reconstructing and exploring their ongoing dialogue. These elements might even be decisive to give this dialogue a new start. Thank you.